Okay. Here we fucking go. Let's get through this. We got up to here. Just one word, 2 words there. Colonic interrogation. I like that. Aftermath is quite a specific genre. Does it include variations with an intermediate step? Are there broader genres for what comes after the mouth part? Aftermouth to vagina, back to arse? I never thought the order in which sexual acts were performed would be so critical to arousal. A brain is quite capable of being highly functionally superior, but for want of a better word, wasted on account of what may be referred to as the memes with which it is equipped. These memes most likely developed during childhood, and other representation of the reward system developed by the child in response to the combination of their genes and environment. Of course, everyone will believe themselves to be equipped with the best memes, whilst it's far easier to quantify how functionally effective their brains are. Similarly, my belief that if only the memes instilled in me could find their way into a brain superior to mine, they would develop and be more beneficial to society as a result. Instead of clean me on a dusty van door, right, great, now I've got a dusty finger. That's going to change the world, that is. The way people seem to think about the bell curve with regards to employment and practical implementation, the topic of discussion on Sam's latest podcast, seems to be fairly easy to characterise. Assuming there is a limited number of positions available, whilst it would seem highly logical to draw a vertical line, presuming IQ is along the x-axis, and number of people from each group is on the y-axis, that makes a fairly blunt statement that someone will only hire people equal to or above a certain IQ. Most people seem to be of the opinion that instead a horizontal line should be drawn so that instead of selecting for intelligence equality, equality of diversity is prioritised. This seems like a noble thing at first glance, but upon digging deeper, one realises that all this truly serves to do is devalue a person's individuality and merits. I imagine if you were to remove the bell curves from the graph and ask where the line should be drawn, in this hypothetical scenario, a greater percentage of people would opt for the vertical, especially when asked to justify their choice. It's only when the realisation of the implications arises that the logic becomes apparently questionable. Charles Murray's statement in Sam's most recent podcast that upon seeing a black person on his university campus, he almost subconsciously acknowledged that that person was likely more intelligent than himself because the added struggle that was inherent among black communities as a result of the time they lived in could easily be misconstrued as racist. It was not so, because he understood and had more information than that which is only available visually, and realised the probability that in order to attain the same position at his university, the black-skinned individual would have needed, wrongly, from a moral standpoint of course, greater intelligence to overcome the obstacles that were not experienced by Charles on account of his treatment by society because of his skin colour. The racist version of Charles' statement would have been whenever he saw a black person on campus, he would have assumed it was impossible for that person not to be smarter than him because of the colour of his skin and nothing else, because that is demonstrably untrue. What I really dread is anyone looking at or hearing what I've said/written posthumously, for me obviously, I'd assume they're still alive, and drawing conclusions about the condition of my so-called psyche and psychological stability. For example, when I discuss my feelings towards suicide, they may be led to make assumptions as to my mental health and will probably assume I'm not aware of the scenario. And of course this assertion would probably go unchecked, because I'd be too dead to correct them. This problem applies to broader topics than just suicide though. People would also be inclined to look at the date of something I've said and perhaps seem to have changed my tune or just my general demeanour in the next recording the very same day. And because I failed to address the change explicitly in my speech, I therefore am oblivious to the change. Again, this is not the case. Of course, if I truly were not aware of it, then I wouldn't be able to acknowledge whether I was or not. But my understanding of how often I am aware of these changes leads me to believe that most of the time the opportunity arises for me to not notice these changes. I do in fact notice them. I just don't feel obligated to address them every time I do notice them. Shove it up your arse, you little cuntbag. And so I did. Shove it up my arse. For what was I than a lowly little cuntbag? For what more was I than a lowly little cuntbag? There we go. Florence Blizzy, Leprechaun and Ferromagnetic Squirrel. And as I settled the noose around my neck, I saw a glimmer in Robot AGI's eye that said one thing: see you later, cunt. And I knew humanity would live on. Sherlock hoax. John should be a Lego character superimposed by a green screen. No, I'm not here to make you feel bad, but I'm going to do it anyway. Oh, I've already done this one. Holiday homes. Oh yeah, so in addition to the garage being a home for your car and leaving homeless people, people actually have holiday homes, which is some people have 2 houses and only use one, whilst loads have no house. But perhaps that's too real. Nah. Building on existing friends. Oh, this is a bloody immaculate society thing. Have you noticed how petty autocorrect has gotten? Before, when it was young, it was just trying to help out and there was a nice bond between it and the user. Okay, every now and again we made fun of it behind its back, but it didn't know, so we got away with it. Well, I think it found out about some of the things we said about it. Now if you write iPhone with a lowercase I, it corrects you. Excuse me, it's actually iPhone. If the war on drugs really is a war, with the fucking Nazis forcing people into rehab concentration camps. People have some fairly interesting views on addiction. A lot of people don't believe it exists, and I guess they say that because they can't really imagine ever being addicted to anything because of their superior willpower. Well, I think addiction is actually quite logical. If you feel like shit, who knows? Maybe you grin and bear it for an arbitrary amount of time and the suffering will slowly dissipate. But you know there's something you can take or do that will make you feel exactly the way you want to feel immediately. You know it because you've had so much experience with it. It's guaranteed. You'd be an idiot not to do it. Everyone's addicted to something a certain amount. You could stop walking, but you won't. Talking, I'm sure the whole world would be better off if you gave that up. Some of my most feared emotions are those that follow these scenarios. Not saying something in answer to a question, or that was in general clever, witty or funny, and not being able to convince others that you truly had thought it. Having some sort of superpower or other ability and then losing it and not being able to regain it, not being credited for an idea or joke, some other intellectual property, even if it's simply a matter of someone coming up with the same idea independently. It happened recently, my idea about consciousness being a spectrum, and therefore when discussing it we should really be discussing consciousness as we know it, and the implications that some people cannot be objectively judged as being more or less conscious than others. The wonderful YouTube algorithm brought a lecture from 2012 by Susan Greenfield, Baroness, might I add, that made almost exactly the same assertion. Great video, by the way. But this fucking hurt. I knew it was highly unlikely that I'd be the first person to have this thought, and just like the hypothesis that ideas have timelines suggests, this was one that was likely to experience a peak at this particular point in time. It's the same with anything. Those things which are most prominent in the public sphere, especially within certain circles, will be in the minds of more and more people simply because that's what they're exposed to. And obviously, given the age we're in, more people are far more likely to be thinking about things like consciousness and AGI than about ways to improve blacksmithing techniques or how to turn stones into cutting tools, or which galaxy will offer the highest potential yield for energy efficiency to colonize with a new generation of superspecies. And this actually affects the world around us. It reminds me of a time I wanted to buy an encyclopedia, because I'm an idiot. And even though my mind wasn't at all conscious of the word or idea of encyclopedias at all times, on multiple occasions the word would jump out at me from places where, if I didn't have a subconscious interest in the word, I would never have known they'd been there. Also, this phenomenon would have been going on to a lesser extent in the previous times. Now, however, the spread of information is greater than ever, and so thoughts can be shared across the world. Also, when before people might well have had the same idea at similar times, and only one or a few of them would have ever shared it, and then even fewer shared it via a medium that would have made it widely accessible and long-lasting. Now everyone shares all of their ideas to a potentially infinite audience for an indefinite period of time. The point of all this is that yet another spanner is flawed. The point of all this is that it's yet another spanner in the flawed notion of free will. You are just the sensation of being a conscious observer, being pushed around by the storm of the universe and causality. Again, the idea of being a conscious observer is misleading. Hence I said the sensation of this experience, and whilst it may be tempting to ask who is experiencing the sensation, sadly the answer is nothing really. The very experience of experiencing things is itself just another side effect of the universe progressing the way it is. There's nothing special about it in any real sense, and whilst it may be real to us, and therefore special in that regard, because it's unique that it itself can be self-aware, and it is still meaningless. Furthermore, now that the realization that the vast majority of the thoughts I have are not unique, and have been / are being thought by many people before now and currently, now that this is being made clear to me more and more often, nearly everything I think to be innovative turns out just to be repetitive, use of that word, but whatever. What's the point of even thinking at all? Again, I realise that this shouldn't really change anything given the impossibility of free will, but the loss of the sensation of individualism is kind of debilitating. It's hard to indulge my messiah complex if we're all bloody messiahs. Something you can do to try and minimise the likelihood of just repeating other people's ideas is try to differentiate yourself from the common person as much as possible, the easiest way of which is to specialise in a certain field, and the more distinguished and experienced you become in that field, the more unique you become, and therefore the less likely other people will be having similar ideas to you. To that idea, I say, fuck off. I, for one, am drawn ever more to the idea of escaping the whole charade with my good friend, suicide. If people in comas can have fMRI scans done and visual representations produced that prove they respond to stimuli from the outside world, surely a form of communication could easily be set up. Again, in the Susan Greenfield Consciousness lecture at Melbourne University, one of the panellists at the end described a similar scenario where apparently coma patients did respond to auditory questions. Obviously, what I describe would be the most rudimentary form of communication, and far more innovative methods would allow far more complex conversations to be had, but as a proof of concept, it would be fairly interesting. Supposedly, there were clear differences in the brain's response to being told to imagine playing tennis and some other thing. It doesn't really matter what. If you tell the coma patient that the experience of playing tennis will be assigned the meaning yes, and the other thing no, then surely they can answer questions by thinking about either playing tennis or the other thing. You may ask me right now, why can't they just see the difference in the brain when they mean yes or no? And my answer would be that I imagine it's too hard to make a clear distinction between actual uses of language and how they occur in the brain, whereas imagining an action like playing tennis can be easily differentiated from, well, the word no, I guess. I think I may have used the word apathy in the past when I may actually have meant anhedonia. I wonder how effective rewards can be in training oneself. Probably works better for positive rather than negative training. Hard to know when to reward yourself for not smoking, but it's easier to do it straight after playing piano, or solving a crossword, etc. How effective is masturbation as a reward? Okay, that's going to be the end of that thing. Look at those little